Okay, let's have a look now at the 5th round game between David Howell playing white and Magnus Carlsen playing black. So Magnus played very energetically in this game with black, playing Sicilian defence, and maybe it's the influence of Kasparov, playing razor sharp Nidorf variation. So knight f6, and now this move a6, which cuts out bishop b5 check lines. So black aims for that seemingly provocative, Scheveningen type pawn structure with e6. But white's inserted this move h3 now, which makes it, less than standard. So h3 is kind of a committal, to g4, bishop g2, maybe later white following up with f4. The problem with it is it potentially creates this vacuum, and if this bishop can be exchanged off, white will suffer on the light squares in principle, and in practice that did actually happen in this game. It was demonstrated that the vacuum of white's position on the king side through a very energetic play though by Magnus, playing all the thematic kind of stuff later, with b5 and bishop b7 at the perfectly timed moments in the game, it seems. So e6, and black has that Scheveningen type pawn structure. So the flexibility for either d5 or e5 later, when white is uncomfortable with either of those options. So it's great flexibility and dynamism in black's structure, and black's kind of solid. And he hasn't got too many issues. He's got potential c-file pressure later as well. Potentially c4 is going to be useful. And potentially this bishop can be sort of liberated on this diagonal, and in this line with h3 it's going to be facing that counterpart on g2. So g4. Now we see this move bishop e7, and for me, I used to like playing this with black. It's very provocative. As long as you don't get hacked up on the king side, you can enjoy very nice dynamism, and you haven't got any major structural weaknesses, like d5 or whatever. These pawns are protecting all the central squares, so it's kind of a tight, dynamic position which offers lots of counterplay. So bishop g2, knight fd7, an interesting move, maybe proactively, against g5. The knight can at some point come to knight e5 to maybe threaten knight c4, or maybe just be more provocative for f4, maybe to jump to g6. So this knight fd7, very interesting proactive retreat. Bishop e3, and now knight c6. So Magnus is not too concerned at the moment about this diagonal. Knight takes c6, b takes e5. There's always d5. There's no big problem challenging that knight on d4 here. It doesn't have to rush to castle. But now after queen d2, is white threatening, seemingly scary, castling queenside and going to bash black on the king side? Well, Magnus is not too concerned at all. He just simply castles, and white actually doesn't castle queenside, although he's given himself that option with that move queen d2. He just castles on the king side. So who has won the opening battle so far? It's just a very rich position with a lot of tension here. Can black unravel these queenside pieces and start to generate some real pressure on the c-file, maybe this vulnerable c4 square? Well, immediately actually c4 is targeted with this next move, knight de5. So knight c4 now has this threat of forking these guys. So white makes a slight concession again in pawn structure, b3. Now, are these weaknesses going to tell? At the moment it looks as though white's as safe as houses, but pawns cannot go backwards, and that rule affects GMs as well as mere mortals, that these pawns are all creating vacuums. And is the c-file a big problem though for white? Well, it's interesting actually that white tried to share the c-file in this game, but knight takes d4, bishop takes d4. Okay, exchanging pieces in general is going to increase maybe the potential for weakness exploitation, unless white's going to get a big endgame advantage using that space. This is often good for black to kind of get some pieces off. Now knight g6 generates some possibilities, maybe knight h4, but also the bishop is free on this diagonal to sort of be provocative. and be annoying. And maybe, you know, bishop h4 is going to be useful if the bishop ever goes back to f2. Because if these bishops can be exchanged off, you can imagine the dark squares getting even weaker in white's position. Bishop e3. And now a hint of queenside counterplay being generated. Queen c7. So is a battery going to be set up with a rook behind the queen soon? Well, knight e2. And Magnus's first task, actually, knight e2 unblocks the c pawn, as though white is preparing c4, and he'd have a nice Maroczy bind. So this is Magnus's chance, actually, to do something about the bishop. So he plays b5, which looks like a fairly standard move. You know, bishop b7. Black looks, you know, quite comfortable here. This seemingly aggressive formation, you know, it has its gaps on the dark squares, on the light squares potentially. Potentially it's a big vacuum to exploit. So c4 though, and white wants to share that c file. After takes, we have rook ac1. Pardon me. Okay, so Magnus he doesn't mind white sharing the c file. He plays bishop b7. He's solved most of the issues in his position so far, just connecting his rooks finally. So it looks as though it's kind of a tidy, solid position for black. Rook takes c4, queen d7. Okay, queen d7. What is the purpose of this? Well, maybe, you know, rook's gonna switch to c8. Black's pieces are all kind of nicely placed. Rook fc1, and now the immediate threat of rook c7 has to be, you know, something done about that. So rook ac8, fine. Okay, does white have some piercing pressure on the queen side? Maybe that c7 square to be pressurized even more. Well, the next move tries to do that, bishop b6. So seemingly menacing threat of rook c7, but it's parried with Magnus taking on c4 and now just rook c8. So he doesn't mind getting all the rooks off. Queen c2, and now the other rooks come off. Okay, what has white achieved really? Well, maybe a6 looks a bit vulnerable. You know, maybe there's a potential in theory for a passed pawn on the queen side, but there's a lot of play left in the position. And this next move, sneaky little move, queen e8, gets this potential battery now of bishop and queen on that diagonal, on e4, potentially liberating with that d5, which is always a facility of having this Scheveningen pawn structure, either d5 or e5 at the opportune moment. So a4, okay, as if white, you know, is going to seal up the queen side, you know, maybe with a5 or just try and generate a passed pawn maybe. But now queen a8, and black's aiming to liberate now with d5. So this battery has a purpose. The a6 pawn is offset by black's potential counterplay now in the centre. And we see now a committal pawn move again from white. This f4. Now this vacuum really is becoming a major concern, especially if pieces are removed. These squares are going to get weaker and weaker. Magnus is now playing a very interesting move, which is actually kind of difficult to explain. Maybe h6 maybe discourages g5 at a simple level. Maybe the back row is also not such an issue in future variations. The king's given an escape pigeonhole, but it's also a quiet waiting move, saying, you know, what is actually white doing with all these pawns? If f5, there's always like knight e5 gaining a tempo on the queen, so e6 is not a major issue here. Okay, now this bishop, although it's pointing at thin air, and the queen invasion with queen c7 is not particularly on, because the bishop takes e4, so the queen's kind of committed to guarding e4. White actually plays bishop f2, and now we see this cheeky little, you know, off of the bishop exchange, expose that vacuum of potential weaknesses around the king, especially the dark squares. So white's not interested in the bishop exchange, bishop e3, but now bishop f6. So has Magnus just improved his pieces just slightly, a little bit further now, with bishop f6 controlling this diagonal? okay, although the bishop hasn't got any major targets there, but you know, his other pieces are doing, you know, a nice job here. This knight's also, you know, maybe threatening useful stuff. D5 is on the cards, so queen d3, and now we see a very interesting move, bishop c6. So the queen's virtually pinned, you know, guarding e4, so it can't really snap d6. But this bishop c7 means queen b7 is now on the cards. Maybe that backward, you know, b pawn is actually a target. And also b4 is stopped by this bishop c6. You know, there would be bishop takes a4. So white's getting a bit locked down, really, on the queen side. Knight g3. Okay, this introduces maybe threats like knight h5. But the knight's kind of committed when it stands on h5. It's all eggs in one basket syndrome. Bishop e7, the knight comes to h5. So can Magnus generate queenside counterplay, or get round the back of white's position to try and, you know, pin pieces and cause general devastation? Well, he's got a concern though about g7 here as well. That, you know, the knight is doing something concrete that maybe in some lines this is going to be nasty, you know. So actually he safeguards g7 with bishop f8, and now we see bishop f2 again. So, you know, okay, has white achieved something here that now this distant bishop e7 to h4 is now not possible, really, because is black getting tied down to g7? Well, the queenside counterplay is now starting to be activated with queen b7. Okay, again, there's potential threats to factor in all the time, this d5. So white plays queen c4. So what does queen c4 do? Well, white maybe is just trying to lock down the position and is waiting again. You know, it's, both sides are waiting to see what each other are doing. Knight e7, as though d5 might be on the cards, and finally it's played now. Queen d3, d5. So we see now white's pawns becoming kind of fixed after e5, and we see a very fine move, d4. So the battery is exploited. If takes, knight takes c6, bishop d4 would look very unpleasant. You know, maybe takes and queen b3, and with that vacuum, that would be a huge vacuum around white's king. Pardon me. So David plays bishop f1. And it's clear that, you know, black is getting serious counterplay now. Bishop d5. This looks kind of unpleasant for this poor backward b3 pawn. And here, though, bishop f1 did threaten to win the a6 pawn. So we have an exchange of prisoners, Nxd4 speaks, exchange of weaknesses there. So b3 for a6. So there's an outside pass pawn in theory, but in practice it's just munched here actually immediately. Queen takes a4, queen takes d4. So what has the simplification caused? Well, actually the black queen is very, very dangerous, it seems, in this position. Queen a8, and it's free to roam, you know, to various squares around here, like a2, you know, a3. And this nice battery, black's bishop is beautiful. This bishop is now passive on f1. Queen a7. Okay, so queen c8. Black's now threatening maybe queen c1, creating a nasty pin. Queen c5, stopping that. Knight c6. So knight c6 attacking the queen. Queen moves again, and now queen a8. Again, you know, the queen and the bishop and these pieces are generally all, you have good access to the centre. And now a committal move, you know, white is pushing his pawns too much in this game. It's easy to say, but it's just so tempting, you know, to push pawns to try and cause damage. But unfortunately, this is just damaging white now, this g5. Easy to say in retrospect, but the black queen is causing a lot of devastation here, and there's a really concrete threat now set up with this very precise move. Next, I wonder if you can spot it here. So you're faced with a seemingly very, very dangerous threat of g takes and knight f6, and your king getting ripped to shreds because of queen g3. So, you know, what would you do here in this position? This is what I'd call a a very critical position, one which needed carefully to be calculated. So if I could give you 10 seconds here, what if you were black? What would you play here? Okay, it wasn't taking the pawn. It was this sly queen move, Queen A4. It actually threatens Queen E4, which threatens Queen H1. Very nasty stuff. So there isn't really time for G takes. Queen E4 is really that powerful that White has to do something immediately about it. So Queen G3. And now we see not Queen E4, but a switch now to D1, hitting the knight, but also setting up Bishop C4. So this Queen and Bishop is kind of a really dangerous combination, and it encourages a piece sack here. You know, White's getting desperate now. He plays check, but it really is a harmless piece sack. The king tucks away on H8. So Queen D3 now. And Magnus is happy to exchange off queens. There's a piece up. So knight b4, and he just manages to simplify now. Knight d5, hitting that f4 pawn, and now knight f4, hitting h3. It's all a bit downhill. E takes, and now bishop e6. If the bishop moves, then you know h3 is going to be dropping off. So it keeps on that diagonal, but it's hopeless now. It's just a piece down. Knight e6, and now after bishop c5, piece down. You know, just David hands in the towel. He resigns here. But it's fascinating the collapse from White's committal kind of pawn moves in the opening. That h3. So Black plays really in the spirit of the Scheveningen, provocation, creating weaknesses, exploiting vacuums. All of that is kind of demonstrated, I think, in this game. Interesting twist here, White showing the C file. It seems, you know, in theory, this trump card of White having the 2-to-1 pawn majority, it really didn't mean that much. Or the infiltration point on C7 didn't mean much, because Black's just able to just calmly trade off the rooks. So Black just remains solid and energetic with the queen, and really well timing that D5 actually. When he played for that D5, after safeguarding, you know, these vulnerable spots, G7, it was very, very interesting, this D5 here, how it ended up, you know, the weaknesses all swapping off for each other after D4, but it meant this vacuum was actually more exploitable around the White king. So Queen A4, very energetic queen move, as though White was on the brink of something really dangerous. But these very energetic queen moves with very concrete threats spelled disaster for White, having to give up a piece. And Black's just able to simplify down now with some basic moves, and then just White resigned here. So it was a great win for Magnus, a very sharp line of Sicilian, great demonstration of provocation, creating weaknesses and exploiting vacuums. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.